So today we're going to have a look at how food chains and food webs can be disrupted. We're going to talk about the word interdependent, what that means, how organisms in a food web are interdependent, and we're going to talk about how toxic materials can build up, toxic substances, poisonous things can build up in a food web and affect the populations in that food web. So this is a pilot fish. Pilot fish grows up to about 2 feet long, so if you've got a couple of rulers and laid them end to end, that's about the size of one of these things. They spend a lot of time around sharks. So this is a great white shark. They spend a lot of time around great white sharks. You would have thought that they'd get eaten by these great white sharks, but they don't. Pilot fish don't get eaten by sharks. This is because they have what's known as an interdependent relationship. Pilot fish and great white sharks are interdependent. Let's see what that word actually means then. So the inter bit of interdependent means between. You might have an inter-house football match, which would be a football match between two houses at your school. You use the internet, which is the system of cables that links together different networks. It's the cabling between networks. So the internet, that word inter then means between. The dependent bit means relying on. So two things relying on each other. That's what interdependent means. Things that rely on each other. So the way that they rely on each other, the pilot fish will eat things off the skin of the shark. The shark gets covered in parasites and nasty stuff. It doesn't want to have it can't wash itself, it can't scratch, it doesn't have arms and fingers like we do. So the pilot fish are there to eat those things that are growing on the shark's skin. This keeps the shark nice and healthy. Means that it doesn't get diseases or skin infections or anything like that. And it means that the pilot fish gets fed. The pilot fish gets food. It also gets a bit of protection. If you're wandering around all day in the ocean with a great white shark, you're not going to have very much coming up to try and get you. So both are happy. The fish get to stay safe and they get a bit of food. And the great white shark get to stay nice and healthy. So both animals benefit. This is what we call a win-win. Both animals gain some benefit. They are interdependent on each other. They are relying on each other. When two animals are interdependent, we say that it is an example of interdependence. So what other examples are there in nature? There are quite a few. Pause the video, see what you can come up with. So one example would be bees and flowering plants. A really good example of interdependence would be bees and flowering plants. The bees get some food from the plants. They get nectar. A lot of people think it's pollen, but it's the nectar that the bees are after. It's a sticky, sweet liquid that they get for their food. But while they're there, pollen rubs off onto them, and they then go on to the next flower, get a bit more nectar, and they take that pollen there and they fertilize the other flower, meaning that the plant gets the benefit by being able to reproduce. Without flowering plants, bees wouldn't be able to survive. And without pollinators, that's organisms that go around taking the pollen from one place to another. Without pollinators like bees, flowering plants would not be able to survive either. So they have an interdependent relationship. They both rely on each other to stay healthy or to stay alive. Other examples you might have seen would be those birds, the Egyptian plovers that go down into the crocodiles' mouths and get all the little scraps of meat away from the crocodile's teeth. The crocodiles won't snap their jaws shut to eat the bird because it's a benefit to them. If they have bits of rotting meat and rotting food in their teeth could go bad. They could get gum infections. They could get ill, stopping them from being able to eat. The birds get the benefit of getting a bit of food. They get a bit of protection by being close to a crocodile. And the crocodiles get the benefit of staying healthy. So a very similar thing to the shark and the pilot fish. We also see it in things like insects and flowers, as we see here. This is a food web that we've seen before, and this food web contains a lot of interdependence. There are lots of organisms that are interdependent on each other. Without each other, a lot of these organisms would not be able to survive. Now, when we're talking about the number of each type of organism in an area, we call it the population. So what we might say is, the population of giraffes, if we're talking about all the giraffes that we have in a particular ecosystem, in a particular food web here. And the size of that particular population, if that changes, if it gets bigger or it gets smaller, it can affect the size of other populations as well. So this interdependence that we see even if just the numbers of those organisms changes, it can cause changes elsewhere in the food web. So let's take as an example the population of giraffes doubles. So the number of giraffes in this particular example that we've got here has gone up. We've now got twice as many giraffes as we had before. How would other organisms be affected? Pause the video, have a bit of a look and see what's going on. See if you can come up with an answer. Now, I think that it gets quite complicated quite quickly. So we're going to double the number of giraffes, and let's see what that does immediately. We double the number of giraffes. We've suddenly got a lot more food available for the lions, the hyenas, and the cheetahs. You would have thought then that the populations of the lions, the hyenas, and the cheetahs would therefore increase. That's good. That's a nice thing. So what else might happen, though? So it's not just about the lions, the cheetahs, and the hyenas getting a bit more food. So when you have more lions, it's not just that they're going to be eating more giraffes. They might also be eating more cheetahs, more hyenas, more zebras, more wildebeest. So the numbers of those things might start to fall. Notice I said might, because it's not really too clear. We're getting into uncharted territory. It becomes quite tricky to predict what's going to happen. The amount of grass and acacia trees, if we've got more giraffes, you would have thought that the amount of grass and those trees there that giraffes like to eat the leaves of would start to go down, because there'd be more giraffes eating them. That would then mean less food for the zebras. So if there's less grass, because the giraffes are eating more grass, there's going to be less grass for the zebras. The number of zebras is going to go down. If the wildebeest are eating the leaves of the acacia tree, their numbers are going to go down because the giraffes are eating more of that. So if their numbers go down, the zebras and the wildebeest, surely that would mean that the cheetahs and the hyenas' numbers would drop too, because there are fewer zebras and fewer wildebeest for them to eat. And if there's fewer zebras and fewer wildebeest, then surely the numbers of cheetahs, hyenas, and lions would fall. So initially we said the number of lions would increase. Now we're saying that it might fall. Would this then mean if there's fewer predators, that the numbers of giraffes would rise even further? It gets far too complicated far too quickly. And this is one of the reasons why charities like the World Wildlife Fund and other conservationist charities want to protect the numbers of species, the numbers of animals, in particular ecosystems. If you start messing around with it, you start reducing those numbers, it can cause all sorts of problems in the food web. You start increasing those numbers, it can cause all sorts of problems in the food web as well. So we need to try and keep these things stable, or all sorts of nonsense might start to happen. So the population size of every single organism in the food web depends on the population size of every other organism in the food web. What do you reckon is the most important thing of food web? Is it going to be the producers or is it going to be the consumers? Pause the video, see what you think. I think it's going to be the producers. The producers are, I think, the most important bit in a food web, because the green plants, the trees, the grass, all those types of things are where the food is being produced. They are producing their own food. If they were to all die out, there'd be no food for the herbivores, no food for the zebras, no food for the giraffes, and no food for the wildebeest. If there was no food for those guys, there would also be no food for the carnivores, for the cheetahs, for the hyenas, and for the lions. They wouldn't have anything to eat either. So everything above those producers would starve and would die. So arguably the most important bits in a food web are the bits down at the bottom. Okay, on to this next bit. Now this is a long word. Bioaccumulation. 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 That's 7 syllables. That's a very, very long word. We're going to work out what this word means. Let's start off with this. This sign here, this skull and crossbones, is the sign that we use for substances that are toxic. Toxic. Now, a toxic substance is a substance that is poisonous. That means that it could make you ill, or it could potentially even kill you. So some toxic substances, some poisonous substances might make you ill, might make an animal ill, but then they might start to just break down. So the molecules that make up the toxin might react with other things. They get broken down into other molecules, other compounds, and they become harmless. Some will not do that. Some of them will build up. They will accumulate. They will build up inside an organism, and the amount of it will grow inside that organism. When something builds up, fancy word we use for building up is accumulates. So if something is accumulating, it means that it's building up, it's increasing in number. When something builds up inside a living organism, we call it bioaccumulation. So instead of this calling it accumulation, because it's to do with living things, we call it bioaccumulation. The bio bit means life here, so the Greek word bios, which means life. The reason why biology is called biology, the ology basically means the study of, and the bio bit means life. So it's another one of those words that we see around quite a lot. Mercury is a pretty good example of a toxic substance that bioaccumulates, so that it builds up and increases in its amount inside living organisms. Mercury is that runny metal, the only metal that's a liquid at room temperature. Now, mercury poisoning, if you as a human being or any other type of mammal really, mercury poisoning will affect your nervous system. So it can do all sorts of things like make it difficult for you to move your muscles, it can make it difficult for you to see, it can damage your brain, it can do all sorts of nasty things to the parts of your bodies where the nerves are. The reason why this is a problem, the reason why we're talking about it right now, is because paint that contained compounds with mercury in them used to be used on the hulls of boats, so the undersides of boats. And the reason that they used to use it is to stop barnacles and other things from sticking to the surfaces of the boats. This boat here definitely hasn't been painted with a mercury paint, and it's absolutely covered in barnacles, mainly barnacles towards the top, and there's an awful lot of seaweed and some other bits and pieces towards the bottom. The more of that kind of detritus you have on the bottom of your boat, the slower your boat goes, the more energy you have to put in, so the more fuel you have to burn, or the bigger your sail has to be, whatever it might be, in order to get to where you're going. So you don't want that, which is why people used to put mercury paint on the bottoms of their boats. Let's have a look at this. I'm going to set up a food chain. This is a food chain in the ocean. It's going to start off with plankton. Plankton are the producers of the sea, algae and other tiny little microscopic organisms like that. If you want to see them, you need to get a microscope out and have a look that way. They will take up mercury compounds that they find in the ocean with other nutrients that they pick up. They end up with a little bit of mercury inside them, a tiny little bit, not very much. Plankton is eaten by small fish. Here's some small fish. They come along and they eat some plankton. They won't just eat one little plankton. They might eat hundreds or thousands of little planktons. They're the first level of our consumers. And they will absorb the mercury compounds from the plankton. The problem is, though, they don't get rid of them. They don't excrete them. It doesn't come out the other end of the fish. They will build up inside the fish's body. These small fish aren't really harmed because they don't have very much mercury inside them, but it is still building up inside their body. Now, along comes a big fish. This is a tuna fish. Tuna fish is the next level of consumer, and it eats lots of small fish. Those small fish which contain mercury, it eats them, and it eats a lot of them. And as it eats them, the mercury that's found inside the fish builds up inside the tuna's body. So this tuna fish now has quite a lot of mercury inside it. The fish isn't particularly harmed, but it does now have quite a lot of mercury. Next along come human beings with their fishing rods, and they fish for the tuna, they eat the tuna, and they end up filling up with loads and loads of mercury. And as the mercury builds up inside their bodies, the people end up becoming sick. They get mercury poisoning. Now I'm going to put a line on the slide showing the amount of mercury that's built up inside these different organisms. With plankton, we've got a small amount of mercury. Small fish, they've got a bit more mercury inside them because they've eaten those plankton that contain mercury and it started to build up inside their bodies. The big fish come along and they eat those small fish which have already started to build up the mercury, and it starts to build up more and more inside the big fish. We come along, we catch the tuna, we eat the tuna, and we end up with a lot of mercury inside our bodies, even more than was in the big fish. By the time it gets to us, there's so much mercury that's accumulated inside the body that we end up with mercury poisoning. Let's think about this another way. And instead of mercury, let's say that the plankton, each one of those has got a pound. They've found a pound. When they're collecting up their nutrients, instead of collecting up mercury compounds, what they do is they find a pound coin. Each one of them finds a pound coin. They don't have very much money. Each of them just a pound. Now the small fish come along, and each of those small fish might eat 100 plankton. When they eat the 100 plankton, they take the pound coins from those plankton, and now each of those small fish has 100 pounds. Now that's already quite a lot more than the plankton had. it started to accumulate that money. Now the big fish come along and they might eat 100 of these small fish. So these small fish that had 100 pounds each, the big fish is now eating those, 100 of those. 100 times 100, 10,000. So that big fish now has an awful lot of money, or the analogy is an awful lot of mercury building up inside it. So along comes the human being, catches, say, 10 tuna fish and eats those 10 tuna fish. Each of those tuna had 10,000 pounds. Got 10 of them, it's eaten. 10,000 times 10, it's now eaten 100,000. 100,000 pounds. That's a lot more money than that initial plankton, which only had £1. So hopefully you can see how that analogy is about how the mercury builds up. Only a little bit of mercury in the plankton, but by the time it gets up to the humans, because it's all accumulated inside these living organisms, it starts to accumulate inside the humans, and that causes them to become sick. So that's it. We've had a look at interdependence. We've had a look at how animals within a food web depend on each other. And we've now had a look at bioaccumulation, how toxins can build up inside a food web or a food chain, ending up harming the animals at the top without necessarily really harming the organisms down at the bottom of the food chain.